Welcome to the Nebraska Soybean Board Weekly Market Roundup, being brought to you by Nebraska soybean farmers and their checkoff. I'm Susan Littlefield. You're going to might be seeing in the background some movement going on because we were at the Nebraska State FFA convention that is actually wrapping up on a Friday afternoon as we recorded. Into this evening, they'll be making the selection of their new state officers. A lot of kids, a lot of contests, a lot of busy times for these FFAers. And what was really cool is some great questions coming from these FFAers when it comes to the USDA report that came out on Friday. We're going to dive into that report in depth today on this week's episode.
Imagine a future fueled by soy-based possibilities. A future where creativity and productivity live together under one roof. A future that takes you from point A to point B to point Z, all while ensuring brighter tomorrows for our next generation. A soy-based future? It's already here.
And welcome back once again. As you can see, joining me today is Mike Zuzolo. Mike is with Global Commodity Analytics, and just want to give a quick shout out to Sue Martin. She was supposed to join us today, but they had a situation happen within the family. Everything's good, but she was unable to join us. So Sue, Mike, USDA report never leaves us wondering, and that's total tongue-in-cheek, because every time these numbers come out, we wonder a little bit about what these numbers are going to say. They're just the initial numbers that are coming from the USDA. We know these numbers can change, but for you, what was the biggest surprise, shall we say?
Yeah, and as you said, our hearts and thoughts go out to Sue and her family, and hopefully everything works out okay, and they're doing okay this weekend. And we sure miss her on this report day. I guess, Susan, it's not unlike what we see about every March. And I think it was a good report overall from a standpoint of answering key questions, whereas the, stocks report was a lot more conclusive. And I think that's what we needed, because we had gone into the report with a May Dees corn spread that was a plus, very strong plus, an inversion, a May Nove bean spread that had been a very strong inversion, and we kept those inversions. We actually closed that May Dees corn spread upwards of 90 cents positive, and that May Dees or May Nove bean spread at about $1.85 positive to the May. And so going into the report, I think what I was wondering most about the grain stocks was, were they going to be as tight as the spread suggested, or would we see a sloppier grain stocks number because of the weaker export pace that we've all been talking about the past 2 to 3 months, even with the corn picking up the pace with China? We did get a lot stronger incentive to continue to buy. I think the end users were caught a little bit short here. I think they've been buying mostly hand to mouth now in our part of the country, Nebraska, Kansas, and in the listing area of rural radio. You've got a situation where we're just out of corn. I mean, we've heard that, and the numbers today confirm that, with 30+% less in Nebraska in some cases as far as on-farm numbers. So I mean, I think that's where the spreads came in. They told us what was going to happen. They were correct. And I think that plays a big role in the acreage number. And we can get to that in more detail. But I think the grain stocks were tight enough, because they both came in on the corn and beans below the average trade guess, that the trade's going to probably feel like they need to get the corn acres safely planted before they bite into that apple of 92 million, which is what USDA gave us today.
If we could rewind to earlier in this week when you and I had a conversation on the Fontanelle Final Bell, we were talking about those empty bins and who was the ones that owned this grain. And I think today's report just reiterated what a lot of folks have been talking about.
Yeah, and I just talked to a colleague of ours in Illinois, and we were talking about a grain merchandiser he and I both know that I saw just a couple weeks ago back in Champaign, Illinois. And I got the sense from that grain merchandiser he was just buying hand to mouth, because quite honestly, they had plenty of corn. They didn't need to bid up. And again, the grain stocks report showed us this big distinction between the Eastern Corn Belt, Central Corn Belt haves versus the Western Corn Belt have-nots. So the question now becomes, do the Western end users and commercials, feedlots, ethanol plants, do they really go after the corn now and essentially arbitrage and make it worth the while of the central and eastern belt corn to get out into our areas even more so than what we have already experienced? And I think that's a big question for next week. And if we do see a spike in basis next week in the Western Corn Belt, and I think the cash market will react to that overall. And I think the futures can react to that, and that spread stays strong. And I think that's the key as we go into April. And just to kind of round it off, how critical is this? Well, it's about 20 degrees in Rapid City, South Dakota, and it's 80 degrees in Kansas City. So that's the kind of spring weather pattern we're in right now when it comes to getting ready to get into the planters or not be able to get in the planters at all.
Definitely hit that, especially when you look to North Dakota. Now, North Dakota had the largest state with the most corn numbers predicted by the USDA today. And you and I were talking before the show. There's a lot of snow up there at this point. So there's a lot of what ifs. And that's probably one of those numbers we might see adjusted as these reports come out in the next couple months.
Yeah, and I think that's where the grain stocks gave us a more solid, conclusive number and an attitude in the trade. The acreage, like it always is, almost always in March, is a conjecture. It's a guess at this point. And you're right, the northern tier and the southern tier corn belt states in spring wheat, and we noticed this, the spring wheat futures had a very strong run on Friday's close because of these acreage numbers and the weather. I think you're right. I would also say that maybe 92 million corn acres could be the very top number now that we see, and we've kind of hit the high water mark based upon the weather. But USDA came in number one with 6 million more principal crop acres. That's a big question mark in my mind. And number two, I think they got caught up in the bean corn ratio because they oftentimes use that in their March analysis. And keep in mind, they did their figuring between February 15th and essentially March 10th or March 6th, somewhere around there, February 20th, March 10th area. That's when we were collapsing in that bean corn ratio. And I think they felt like we bought a lot more corn acres, and I'm not so sure about that. So again, I'd reiterate the idea that if that bull spread continues to work in the corn market and the beans stay solid and the wheat doesn't want to take out its recent lows, I think we have a chance now to maybe build upon Friday's gains. Corn, beans, and wheat all closed the month higher. Even soft red wheat closed higher than where we were in February's close. That's a good sign as we end the month and end the quarter as well.
Well, as we continue here at the Nebraska Soybean Board Weekly Market Roundup, let's look at the soybeans. Nebraska, Wisconsin, two of the states that come right to the forefront of my mind that have a lot of increase in soybean acres for this growing season.
Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense because of cost of production, and a lot more. I think soybeans are going underwater at this point just because I think they do a little bit better than the corn in terms of what type of irrigation systems you have. And I still think the fertilizer and seed costs really mattered this year when it came all down to it. The other thing on the soybeans is if you take USDA's numbers of corn, beans, and wheat and you kind of program those through their agricultural outlook supply demand tables, we're going to be looking at about a 2.2 billion bushel carryover in corn and about a 260 carryover in the soybeans. And so they're both about the same. Yes, that's a little tighter in the soybeans and the corn, but really at these elevated new crop prices for soybeans versus corn, I think the market's very well balanced. But I told clients at midday on my flash update that I really want to watch the bean corn ratio from here, because if the beans start to lead again next week after having done what they've already done before the report, I think this is where maybe popping out of some soybean hedges and letting this market run might be a good idea, not just because of the report, but also because the Brazilian currency just made a new 8-week high against the US dollar. And the Argentine price at the upriver, the export market, is really starting to move. It moved about $20 a ton this week. And I think that really means a lot given that Brazil has been falling rapidly. So more of a balance in the South American price, a better currency equivalent for us when it comes to Brazil. And I think these things, when you add it all up, if the beans can go higher, it's probably going to be because the corn and the wheat led them.
So Ken, we know that China has been so much into this market buying in this last week. If we're that short supplied and they're wanting these deliveries in August, should there be some nervousness in the market of can we meet those?
Yeah, and that's a great question, and that is probably the difference between a 650 D's corn price and a 750 plus D's corn price, because what's in the middle of this between us planting and us harvesting is the Brazilian safrinha crop. And it's been really on a tight knife edge when it comes to the weather. It's supposed to improve a little bit here in the next 1 to 5 days, maybe the next 6 days. But then overall, April, the private meteorologists that I look at and follow and buy into are suggesting that we're going to turn back hot and dry in center south Brazil and southern Brazil as we get deeper into April. And I think, Susan, if we do that, that could really trim that crop size because of how late they got in the ground as far as their seed. So that really could make a big difference with China being a big buyer right now.
So as you break down these local numbers as we get closer to wrapping up here, do we see any concerns as we go to spring planting and knowing that we're going to see some acre wars kind of adding already to this layer?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is where it goes back to almost a 13 and a quarter November bean price. And you have this real fear, and I think it's a justified fear, that we're not going to get all those corn acres planted in areas that would easily go to another oil seed, whether it's soybeans or rape or sunflower. I think you really got to stay on path with the profitability that the soybeans provide. And I would say generally, roughly speaking, by April 15th, if you don't see the country on track on their corn planting, you might want to start thinking about getting some hedges or protection in place for the soybeans.
So you got the weekend to digest all this information and this report that came out. What's your thoughts come Sunday night into Monday that maybe we should be watching for?
Yeah, great question, because the real missing link for me, as you know, Susan, is the wheat market. It's our leader. I think it's still our leader, especially given the hard red wheat, soft red wheat. That made a new record high in that spread, $1.90 premium in lead month when we closed out the week this week. My charts go back to the 80s. I can't find a level on a weekly close we've been that strong. So I think we really need to find some seasonal strength in the wheat. I think the hard red wheat, it's time for it and the spring wheat to bring support to the soft red. If we can do that, then I think the first half of April can be good. And I think that needs to be set up relatively soon, maybe as early as Sunday night.
All right. Well, we appreciate you joining us this week, Mike. Of course, this has been the Nebraska Soybean Board Weekly Market Roundup on the Rural Radio Network.